Thank you for confirming that you can hear me. All right, cool. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Digital Hangout. The Digital Hangout is sponsored by Waymaker Digital, which is an arm of Waymaker Learning. We'll talk about that in a second. But I'm just going to go straight into the business of the evening, which is the topic we are dealing with today is around demystifying API technology. Demystifying API technology. Now, the reason why I think it's important to break this concept of API down is because I've worked with quite a number of organizations, businesses, and individuals, and I see the way the knowledge around the concept of API it's been shared around, and I see a lot of people struggle with that concept. And I think it's important that I spend some time to break it down a little bit without going into too much technical detail. I will be touching on a very high-level conceptual view of what API actually means. I will also be talking about the value that API brings for businesses, the value it delivers for businesses and organizations that use the technology. I will touch on some types of API, what API types are available, do exist, really. And I will also look at some use cases of API, some very basic use cases of some industries or some organization examples where API technology is being used. I'll look into that as well. I might touch on some key considerations when you are developing or when you are building your API, if time permits. But without further ado, let's get into the business of the day. A little bit about myself. My name is Victor Sunday, as you can see on the screen. Passionate around helping companies, organizations, and businesses to solve their complex problems with agile thinking, frameworks of agile, and also deploying software solutions. That's what I'm really passionate about, really. I also provide training, coaching for software teams across different organizations. I teach and I coach on agile, lean practices, agile mindset, the practice of business analysis. I am actually the founder and the creator of the Agile Business Analyst Bootcamp, which has been running in the UK for the past 3.5 years. I also mentor teams and organizations on service design and the design of products and services, digital products. I've got a few organizations I've worked with on the screen there, but yes, if you want to reach out to me, you can always find me on LinkedIn, Victor Sunday, and yeah, say hi, and I'll make sure I respond back. Okay, so the conceptual view of API technology, let's break that down a little bit, because I think it's important to be able to break this down so that you can understand how it works, especially if you're working as a business analyst or a scrum master, or whether you're working as a project manager and you work with developers that interface or work with APIs on a day-to-day basis. Sometimes some of these concepts might be very foreign to you. So my intention is to help you break that down into possibly layman terms that you can understand. So let's look at that. Theoretically, yeah. API actually stands for Application Programming Interface. And basically, it is just a set of standards that describe how information can be exchanged between applications and services. Now, that's a very theoretical description or definition of API. If you go on Google, this is what you likely find on Google. And if you go on Wikipedia, you might likely find so much information that might not really make a lot of sense, especially if you're not a very technical person or if you're not a developer. But basically what this is saying theoretically is you use an API to define a set of rules and contracts. Some people use the word contract a lot. Contract between different applications or different services to understand, okay, between this application A or application B, we want to talk to one another or want to talk to each other. We want to exchange information between one another. How do we understand the language? What language do we speak so that we all understand what we are saying, so that when you make a request to me, I can give you a response back. And because I will have understood your request, and then I expect that you would understand my response. So that's what, theoretically, what API really means. But in a bit more detail, I would say that an API is basically a messenger. Yeah, it's a messenger service. Basically, what it does is it takes a request from one system, yeah, and then passes that request, that message, into another system. Yeah. Now, what's important here, you would notice that I've highlighted some words on the screen. The messenger I put in orange, meaning that is the work that the API does. Yeah. So the API is a messenger. Is a messenger. It basically takes a message from one system to another system. Now, the same messenger actually does not just take the message or take a request. It also, at the same time, delivers a response. So it makes a delivery back to the system who has made the request. So imagine system A wants to know what today's date is from system B. So system A would need to communicate its message in a way that system B understands, so that once the request lands in the hand of system B should be able to open up that message, yeah, read the message, understand that request, and then process the request, look for the information that system A wants, and then package it and put it in another response message and send that response message back to system A. Okay, so I'll repeat myself. It takes a request from system A, delivers it to system B. System B would have pre-agreed between system A and system B how the messages will be shared, what format they'll be shared in, the structure of the message of the request, and also the structure of the responses. So that pre-agreed contract, that pre-agreed way of communicating is what an API really is. And then you send the message, you send the request, and then the messenger will also pick up a response from the recipient of the request, and then delivers the response back to the requester. Yeah. When I'm talking requester now and the recipient, I'm referring to applications, systems, yeah, two separate computers or two separate software services or two separate web applications or two separate mobile applications, yeah. That's what I'm referring to when I'm talking about requests, okay. The other thing to bear in mind, so I'll give you an example, because what's important to bear in mind is that we all engage with applications that consume API services on a daily basis. I mean, as simple as checking the weather. You know, before you go out in the morning, you open your weather app and you want to know if it's going to rain or if what's the weather going to look like in London today. You open your weather app and then you press, okay, give me London and give me London morning time or London afternoon, what's going to happen. What you're doing when you press or when you enter on your mobile phone or laptop or web application or desktop application, wherever you're making that request or trying to find out that information, what you're doing is you're telling that mobile application on your mobile phone, yeah, to talk to the messenger that please take this request and go and fetch this information for me from another system that holds the data, yeah, about the weather. And let that system give me a response back in the form that I will understand, such that I will know what the weather is going to look like in London this morning or this afternoon. Yeah, so that's what you're doing. That's what you're doing really. So the API, I have described the API here as a messenger. API as a messenger. Now, if you remember, if you're following what I've been saying, I've been using the word request and response a lot. So if you find yourself working within the API space or working with APIs, some very familiar terminologies you would have to get used to, or you would of course must have been hearing, is the request and the response, request and response, request and response. So basically the request is basically referring to the call that you make when you say, give me this information. What happens is that your application on your mobile phone or your website basically makes a request call to a separate application or even multiple applications that sit on a different estate elsewhere to say, this is my request and I need this information. And the system will also be able to give you, package back to you, a response that your application will also be able to read, unpack, read, and display to you in the format that you would understand. So one thing you need to be familiar with in the world of API is the API request, and there's always going to be an API response. Now, whether the response is what you're looking for or what you're hoping to hear or not is a separate conversation. It's a different thing. All that would be within the terms and the conditions and the contract between those two systems when you're doing your specification. Let's look a bit further. I've also tried to break API conceptually down in the format of a waiter or waitress. Yeah, imagine you go to a restaurant and you sit down, you want to make your order. Something gets handed over to you, and that's your menu. That's the menu for the restaurant. Now, in this scenario here, you're in the guest in the restaurant or the customer in the restaurant, what you are is you are the one making the request. So imagine you are a system and you're there and you have the menu right with you and you can select items from the menu, yeah? Then say, okay, Mr. Waiter or Ms. Waitress, could you take my order for food, yeah? So the waiter or the waitress in this instance is the API. Yeah, is the application programming interface. So the waiter or the waitress would understand your request. So they will take your request from you, and then they will take your request all the way, which is your order for food, all the way to the kitchen. Bear in mind, once the request is made through the waiter or the waitress and it is going to the kitchen, the understanding is there that once that request gets to the kitchen, once they receive your order, they would understand what they need to deliver to you in form of food. Now, the waiter or the waitress would also wait at the kitchen or go back to the kitchen to make sure that the request that you made, which is in form of your order for food, has been processed by the kitchen, yeah, and packaged together in a way that you would be able to consume it, in a way you'll be able to understand it as the customer who has visited the restaurant. Now, the messenger, which is the API in this instance, would also then take that food from the kitchen, yeah, and then pass it up, bring it all the way to you as the customer, so you can then consume the food you're looking for, or the food you have ordered rather, yeah? Now, in this scenario, the kitchen, yeah, is the recipient system. You have gone to the restaurant to make an order for food, you are the requester. You are the requester system. In the middle, the person that makes sure that what you request is what you get from the kitchen is the API. Yeah? Now, the order in this instance, that's the menu item, is your APIs, what I've referred to as your API specification. So this is the contract, so to speak, that existed before you even begin to make your order. You would have pre-agreed, you would understand it, you would know what to order for, you would know what you're looking for, and the kitchen would understand as well that when you make this order from number 1 or number 3 on the menu, this is what you get. Your number 1 gives you a jollof rice, or number 2 gives you, gives you a coleslaw. So that pre-agreed menu is your API specification that would have been pre-agreed up front. So the API here has been described or represented as a waiter or a waitress. Now let's look a little bit. Let's dig a little bit deeper into the value that APIs deliver, the value that API technology delivers. API makes data accessible. If you follow what I've been saying, so API is the messenger between 2 separate systems or multiple systems that need to communicate and exchange information. Yeah, bear in mind that data is critical to business success in this time and age. Data and your ability to access data as a business can be the North Star when it comes to driving mission critical business initiatives, whether it's improving the customer experience or you're trying to increase information technology efficiencies. Data is very, very crucial. So the ability to be able to exchange data between different applications or different systems is important as a part of driving or executing business strategy or business initiatives. Yeah, a lot of organizations want to improve customer experience, and the way to improve that customer experience is to make enough data available to their customers. It does not mean that the data must sit on your estate or must sit within your application. The API technology makes it a lot easier for multiple applications and systems to exchange data across real time and improve business execution of their goals, of their strategy, whether it's winning a market share or whatever it is they're trying to do. So the value of API technology is accessibility to data accessibility. Now, APIs make it possible to create end-to-end connections, yeah? So you can basically expose and communicate data across multiple channels. Now, bear in mind, I use the word end-to-end. I need to break that down a little bit. So when I say end-to-end, I'm talking about the fact that you make a request and you get a response back. That is the end-to-end journey. Whether the messenger needs to go across multiple locations to be able to find the data you're looking for and give you back the response in a way that you'll understand it and display it back to you, or whether it needs to go to just one system to make a request, end-to-end on the line here is referring to that entire journey from beginning, yeah, to the end. When you engage in the process of making a request, whether it's booking a flight or whether it's checking for the weather, or even whether it's trying to transfer money or download or receive money into your bank account or make payments from your mobile app. You know, that end-to-end experience describes the fact that when you engage, you are getting a full experience all the way from when you make a request and you get a response back every time throughout the entire touch point, throughout the life cycle of your transaction. Okay, so that end-to-end connection basically thrives on the fact that data is exposed in real time. Yeah, so you are able to communicate across multiple channels. What this does for you as well is it enhances digital transformation. So you would hear a lot of digital transformation initiatives and projects going all around the world, and it's interesting to know that a lot of this is made possible by the application programming interface technology. So APIs make this very, very possible, very possible. I've highlighted some key challenges in API development, and one of the greatest challenges of building an API is building an API that will last. Yeah, especially for web APIs. We'll look into web APIs in a second. It's a type of API. Whether you're creating both a contract between you and your users. So for instance, in the case of checking for the weather, of course, in the UK, most people use BBC the BBC weather app. Yeah. So the BBC weather app is used by a lot of people that want to check weather in the UK. Okay, good. Now, there is a contract or there's an engagement between the user of the app and the creator of the app. At the same time, there is also a programming contract, which is what I put in red there, between that mobile app and also the server or the people or the other backend systems that would supply the data required in order for the BBC weather app to satisfy the contract between itself and its users. Okay, so it's a very great challenge. One of the biggest challenges in building API is actually building an API that will last. Because bear in mind, because there is a lot of interactions across multiple services or multiple systems or multiple applications, if anything changes within one application in that value chain, yeah, it can cause a breakdown in the user experience or customer experience or the functionality that the end user, which is the end application, the request in this instance, is trying to provide. Let me put it in another way. If you go into a restaurant and you're trying to order for food, you've been ordering for food at the same restaurant Monday to every day, literally, and you're used to the menu. Every time you go there, you're used to the menu. You know that number 1 is what you have for breakfast, number 10 is what you do for lunch, and when you go there for dinner, is number 15 on the menu. Now, without announcing to you, one day you then walk into the restaurant, and the restaurant has changed their menu. Yeah, it happens a lot of times. What we're saying here is that it's going to be difficult for you if you now say, okay, I want what I would normally have for dinner because I'm here for dinner. So my dinner is number 15. And by the time you make that order, you're going to get something else, or you get an error to say, no, we don't actually supply or we don't provide that service any longer, or we do not supply that food any longer. Okay, so building an API that will last is one of the key challenges because it involves so one of the key consideration is the maintainability of your API, especially if you're building API of you're relying, or your service or your product relies heavily on consuming an API service. Okay, so whether you're creating a service between you and your users, or between you and your server or client, whatever, building an API that will last is one of the key challenges. Let's look at the types of API that exist. Okay, the first one I've mentioned here are what I refer to, or what's been referred to as local APIs. Local APIs are the original form, so that's where the name actually came from. They provide like middleware services. Excuse me. So you would hear things like operating system on your laptop or your device or your mobile phone. So local APIs actually provide the connection between the middleware and the other applications that would work on the system. A good example of local API is the Microsoft.NET APIs, okay, or the telephony APIs that they use for voice applications. For example, you know, when you have Microsoft Windows 10 on your device, if you install an application that cannot communicate on that local device with the OS API, it will not work. So those are that's one type of API. They basically work locally. The popular type of APIs is what we refer to as web APIs. Yeah. Basically, they are APIs that are designed to represent resources like HTML pages. When you type in your browser using the protocol HTTP, yeah, any web URL that you type when you enter into your browser to use the browser system is actually activating a web API. Yeah. So, for example, you go to make an order on Amazon, or you go to Google to browse for Google, maybe Google Maps or something. What you're doing is once you enter the URL, making resource calls like HTTP, you call it that protocol. What you're doing is you're activating a web URL API. Yeah, web APIs are also, most of the time, they're referred to as REST. REST stands for representational state transfer. Some people call them RESTful. Basically, what they mean is that the people who publish those APIs, they don't save any data internally. Okay, so if you make a request to me, I give you a response back. In my request, my request is a state of rest when I do not maintain or I don't keep any data within my API, my request message. Okay, so when I make requests from many users, it can actually be intermingled as they will be available on the internet. So if I'm making a request to system A from my system, or I'm making a request to system C from my system, because I'm using a RESTful API, I'll be able to use the same resource to be able to make multiple requests across many applications, because I'm not maintaining or keeping any data within my request. Okay. The next type of API is what I refer to as program APIs. These ones actually are based on remote procedure call, RPC technology. Like I said, the most popular ones are the web APIs, and I think that is the one that people need to understand and learn and understand how they work. Remote program APIs are basically the ones that can make remote program component appear to be local. So Microsoft Web Services series of APIs, they are actually program APIs. So if you hear about Microsoft Web Services, basically what they do is they make a local resource, yeah, a remote program, a remote application. They make it available locally on your device, yeah. Those are what we call program APIs. Now, I'm going to touch on some use cases of APIs, yeah, some API use cases. The first one I want to look at is healthcare. What I've done here is I have picked an organization and looked at how they have applied the API technology in order to be able to deliver services or experiences for their customer as part of achieving the business goals. Mount Sinai in New York is one of New York's largest private health systems. They were looking for a way to expose data across the organization to ensure that the physicians and employees could get comprehensive understanding of patient needs. Yeah, so API is one of the technology that is giving organizations like this Mount Sinai an upper hand, because they're able to deliver quality patient care. Quality patient care. Now, without referring to Mount Sinai, let's look at this diagram quickly, and you will see how the flow of data works across multiple services. So those services you're looking at there on the screen, or what they're calling API, are different services. So what they do is they are the messengers across this entire landscape. So let's have a look from the beginning. Now, you would see that at the topmost top there, we have the clinic's web portal, yeah, and that is the portal that could be available on the desktop, on the mobile, or even on the on a tablet, and that is where the customer would interface with the hospital, with the clinic, with the service provider. Now, there is a web portal API that provides the experience that the customer is looking for, whether it's patient care or whether it's pharmaceutical care or clinic care, any type of service they want, they'll be able to get that by basically making the call from that web portal. Now, bear in mind, you will notice that we have broken down, they are broken down here, different services that will help the customer to be able to make a request once they hit the website in order to be able to get what they want. Now, the first thing they would have to deal with is an identity service. Yeah, the identity service is the one that provides the ability for the customer to be identified as the right person, as who they say they are, in order to be able to access the information that is relevant to them, to that customer. So the identity service would have to, first of all, engage with the customer. If the customer is coming for the first time, they have to use the onboarding API, because that is a separate request to say, I'm a first-time user, I want to create an account, or I want to make a request. So they use the onboarding. The onboarding API is the one that will take your message when you make a request to say create an account, or when you click sign up on the website. I'm sure those are words that you're familiar with. You click sign up, or you click create a request on the website. The onboarding API would take that and then help you to verify your details with the identity service that sits behind the scenes, which the customer will not necessarily see, and provide the experience back to the customer. Okay. Also, there are other APIs there. For example, the identity management service is the one that would deal with things like recognizing who you are, maintaining your passwords, or keeping your information, making sure that you have access to the right data and all that kind of thing. So the identity service management service will do that. Now, there are other services there like the Fitbit, the Epic system, the Health Cloud, which is driven by Salesforce. There is other components there. And what basically this landscape is telling you here is that as a customer, once you engage from the web portal, you can actually you consume data from multiple API services, yeah, in order to be able to get a full experience. On the flip side, which is on the right side, the MD, which is the user within the organization, yeah, would also be using another portal, which is the Salesforce Experience API, in order to understand and manage how the business is running. For example, they have a CRM that basically syncs with the Health Cloud in order to manage the experience of customers or manage their journey. So this landscape here shows you how an organization is exploiting the power of API technology in order to get value and drive value for their customers. Let's look at another use case. This is a very easy one. I'm sure a lot of people can relate to this one. This is for flight booking. Yeah, flight booking. Now look at this, very, very simple diagram. And what this diagram explains here is when you go to a website and what you want to do is to book a flight. Yeah, so you go to the number one there, you enter your flight requirements. Yeah. When you enter your flight requirements, you click on search flight. Now, what you're doing is you're giving the messenger, which is the API, some parameters and some instruction, which will become your request message. Yeah. So if I enter London City, I'm traveling to my return London City to Paris, and these are the dates I'm traveling, and I'm looking for an economy flight for one adult. Yeah. And I click on search flight. What happens then is that activates a request, and that request message packages everything that I've put in my request and then makes a request carries that request message to the backend system, which could be EasyJet, Jet2, KLM, Business, British Airways, and multiple other airline providers. And what it's doing is sending a request and is also going to be bringing a response back. That response back, when it comes back to the web system, web application, the web application will display that, will open up the response and display it back to you in a results page. Okay, you can see there. So you go from 1, you go to 2. Number 2 is that your request is sent via an API service, yeah, as a message to the airline operators. Number 3 is the airline operators then will open it, authenticate the message, validate and process your request. Yeah, if they have the response you're looking for in the form of flight details that match your requirements that you have put in your request, then they will provide you back a response. Now the API will also bring the response back as a message. Now when the message is coming back to the web application system, which is the website where you're browsing for where you're searching for flights, will then open up the response and then interpret the response messages yeah, in the form of available flight, and then display them to you. The message back displays it to you in a format that you'd understand. So that's where you see, okay, we have, it's not very legible, the image is not very legible, but basically it shows you, okay, for EasyJet, you have a flight going on Friday at this price, at this time. For British Airways, you have a flight going, based on the request you've made, what you're getting back are the responses that are relevant to the request you've made. And then that is the details of the airline operators that meet your flight requirement. And based on that, you're able to make a decision to say, okay, I'm going to book British Airways because it's the cheapest. Or I'm going to book EasyJet because it's the time that I want, or it fits my the time I'm going to travel. Some key considerations when you're developing APIs. I think I haven't touched on this in depth because of time. But the first thing you want to bear in mind is versioning. When you're developing API, if you're writing API specifications or you're writing API rules, you need to bear in mind that you have to plan how are you going to version your API. Yeah. Are you going to include versioning in the URL? So if you look at the example I have there, I've got versioning here. It says my api.mysite.com/version1/resource, because if anything happens such that my resource location is changing, or my data is changing, or my structure is changing within my API from within my organization, I can easily tell my users that, okay, this version of version 1 API is going to be deprecated, and version 2 is now the active one, okay? Towards the end, I will show you some examples of some API services that, especially social media. There's a lot of applications that consume social media API. So versioning is one of the key considerations when you're developing API, because when you're developing API, you have to think about longevity. A lot of users or a lot of web other services, when I say users, I'm talking of other applications or services, would be consuming the data that you provide via your API. So they want to be able to make a call to your API and get a response back that fits or meets their requirement or their needs. The other thing to bear in mind when if you're building API or you find yourself working on an API technology project is the documentation for the API. Documentation of API is very important because when application developers are going to be connecting to your service to consume your API, they will be relying so much heavily on your documentation. Yeah, so they'll be relying heavily on your documentation. So as much as possible, it may seem like, oh, documentation is very easy, it's very quick. We can just do it quickly. No. Pay attention to how you're going to document your API. Yeah, because one of the biggest put-offs or the things that make people not want to use a lot of organizations that produce API is bad documentation, terrible documentation. I mean, I've had loads and loads at Waymaker Digital. We build a lot of applications that consume APIs, especially for like social media or payment gateways or all sorts of APIs. And one thing that, you know, we thrive on, or we really, really lay emphasis on, is how well the API documentation is done. Okay, it may seem like an easy or quick pass, but is one of the biggest challenges when it comes to maintaining API, especially if you're trying to maintain your API or changing versions or deprecating versions or moving to another version of API. You need to make sure that the documentation reflects and clearly explains to your user, the consumers of your API, which will be developers anyway. There will be people developing applications to take data from you in order to be able to serve their own customers using their apps. So documentation is very, very crucial. In fact, is center to the design and development of APIs. Okay, so that is that I'm going to cover today. Before we look at some examples, it's important I mention about Waymaker Learning. So Waymaker Learning, they're the sponsors of the Digital Hangout, and they provide the Agile Business Analyst Bootcamp. If you're an Agile Business Analyst or you're trying to be one, or you're a business analyst you don't have understanding or the practical knowledge of Agile mindset, the Agile philosophy, and the Agile frameworks, please get in touch. You can reach them on the website, www.waymakerlearning.com or Waymaker Digital, the Slack. So they run an open Slack community. I work with Waymaker Learning, and it's a great place to be. They have an Agile Scrum Mastermind if you want to be a part of it. Also, we provide, Waymaker Learning provides CV branding. So if you want to get a job in the technology market or digital area, we provide CV branding, which basically is taking your existing CV and rebranding it for you. Also do LinkedIn profile optimization. They provide on-the-job mentoring and also project work experience to be able to validate your knowledge and give you that level of assurance that will take you to the industry and stand you apart in providing the confidence to hiring managers, organizations about what you do. The Slack community is open and free. Just go on Waymaker Digital, the slack.com, and you can create an account and be a part of the community. It's a great community. Waymaker Digital, the last thing I'll mention before we go and look at some practical API statuses and how APIs work. Waymaker Digital is the consulting arm of Waymaker Learning. And what we do is we provide technology consulting and remote outsourcing services. So if you run an organization or you have a project and you need support in the area of business analysis or agile coaching or UX or UI design, software testing, or even if it's project delivery management, you can join the Slack community, or you can reach out as well on Waymaker, waymakerlearning.com. Now let's have a look at some API services before I take questions. The first one I want to look at is the Twitter API. So if you go on Twitter, just go on Google and type Twitter API. Yeah, you will see. Let's have a look at the Twitter API status actually before we look at the documentation. Yeah, so if you can see, HTTPS api.twitterstart.us, so the Twitter status, basically that's what it is. Now, what it tells you here is if you have a web application that is going to be consuming data from Twitter, whether it's about your users or whether it's about people that follow you or people that follow other people, or you are trying to develop a social media interface that help organizations to structure or do proper engagement on social media. Now, one of the key technology is APIs. So you have to write on APIs to be able to consume or to be able to connect to the social media platform. Twitter is one of the biggest social media platforms. So you can see here that all their APIs are operational. They can see this is information for for developers who are going to be using this API. Okay, so they even have some description here that tells you the kind of information that is the kind of request or service that these APIs are. Another one that we want to show you as well in terms of API documentation is Stripe. So Stripe is one of the payments gateway, Stripe API documentation. Yeah. So you will see here the kind of documentation that Stripe has provided in order for developers who want to use their API in order to process payments from websites. So whether you're building an e-commerce website or you're building a service that collects card payments or whatever it is, Stripe is a payment gateway, payment service provider. And if you notice here, is a web API. So they use the REST method. That's a separate, I'm going to break down the separate conversation. I'll talk about REST separately. But basically, they've described here that if you're going to be consuming our API is organized around REST. Yeah. So you will see here, introduction, yeah, they talk about authentication, yeah, because one important thing is that when you're making a request via API, yeah, you need to first of all authenticate. And most authentication of APIs use the OAuth2 authentication model. So you have to authenticate your account with a secret key so that they know that you are an identified consumer, your application now. That's what I'm talking about. When I say you, I'm referring to your application. Your application is known to us, meaning you are our customer. So we give you a key in order to be able to recognize and authenticate your application, which might be your e-commerce website or your product website or whatever it is you're doing, where you need to process payment, card payment or online payments for your customers, meaning they need to make payment to you. So what they're saying is, we will give you a secret key so that when you are building the API, you can actually connect your web service in order to be able to use Stripe to process payment. So authentication is described there. And also, you can see here, very good documentation. They've also described some errors. So when you're using the API, they're telling you that when you get a 200 message back, it means everything has worked perfectly. Now, one thing to bear in mind when you're using REST is that the type of status code is very important. If you go on Wikipedia, yeah, you can actually get the full information on status code for HTTP request. Wikipedia, HTTP status codes, yeah. You do that easily, yeah. So list of status codes, yeah, for HTTP request. So you can see that it gives you full detail, so 100 all the way, so success codes and all that. So basically what Stripe is doing here is saying that 200 means success. And if you look at the status code, it actually means that it's a successful request, meaning you get the response you're looking for. We have the resource you need, and we give you back to you in our response. There are also other types of errors, so error codes, like for example, 401. You know, remember if you browse some websites and you're making some requests, you get a 401 page, or you get a 404, meaning that the resource doesn't exist in our system. So we don't have that for you. If you're getting like 500 errors, it's basically talking about server errors. So if you're a business analyst or you're a project manager, scrum master, and you're trying to understand how to document for API, or you're trying to work with developers and building APIs, it's important that you understand error codes, status codes of APIs, okay? So yeah, those are the two I wanted to show you today. Thank you for dialing into this digital hangout. I'll try and look out if I've got any questions in the chat. If there are no questions, then I think I've pretty much covered a very high level view of APIs. Now, just to wrap up, a couple of things to bear in mind. Number one, the conceptual view of API. I mentioned to you, let me flip back just to give you a good overview of what we covered on this call on Digital Hangout today. So you think about the API as a messenger, yeah? API is a messenger. Think about it that way. It gives a good understanding. Also, you have to remember that there's always a request and always a response, yeah? Always bear that in mind when you're thinking of API. I've also given you a very simple concept to understand APIs better, which is API as a waiter or waitress. So they're taking the order, going to the kitchen and delivering it back to you. We covered the fact that API makes data available in order to basically provide end-to-end connection across multiple systems and multiple applications. And I mentioned the key challenges in API development, which is the fact that you'd have to think about how do we build an API that will last. The other API, we also covered API types, looked at local APIs, web APIs, and program APIs. Yeah. Also looked at the API use case in healthcare, API use case in flights booking, This session will be recorded, by the way, for those who are asking a question on the chat. The session is recorded. It will be published on the YouTube channel, and the link will be shared with everyone who has attended. And I also mentioned, when you find yourself on an API project, 2 key considerations that you need to think about. There are other considerations, of course. Maintenance is one of them. I've not really gone into, into that in detail, but I've talked about versioning of API. Also, I've talked about documentation. Yeah, I've talked about documentation. The only thing I haven't really gone into is what next time I'm going to do the digital hangout. I really would like to go into more detail around web APIs and also talk more about REST. Yeah, the kind of calls we can make, the kind of commands like the get, the post, the delete, the put. I'll go into more detail on that on the next digital hangout. Okay, I'm going to look at some questions now. I can see some questions coming through. Let's have a look. Actually, there's a lot of questions. Okay, I'll just start from the, I'm scrolling to the top, so I'll just start from the top and see the ones I can pick up. Anyone I don't pick up, trust me, I'm going to cover it on the next hangout. So the one here is, what APIs will you use between databases? Okay, that's a good question. Between databases, it depends on where the database is hosted. If it's a cloud database, if your database is hosted in the cloud, for example, if your database is hosted on, let's say, Google Cloud or Azure database, web APIs would definitely work for those. If your database is hosted on a local device, a local machine, or local server somewhere, then you would have to be thinking whether you should be using a local API, depending on where your application sits as well, or whether you want to expose your database even via web architecture, so that you can, even though your database can sit on a local server, it can still be exposed via web architecture, via API, so that applications can still get data from it. So yeah, that answers that. More questions? Do error codes and statuses differ across languages? No. So HTTP status codes don't differ. What would differ across languages? If you remember, we were looking at different examples earlier on Wikipedia. So status codes or error codes, they do not differ. They are standardized. So whether you're using Python or whether you're using PHP or Ruby or Curl, whatever language you're using to format you're using to write your language program, you would also be you would be following the same status code. They're not different. They don't change. The next question there says, can you explain what you meant by RESTful API instead of REST? So state of REST, so RESTful API actually was proposed by a guy called Roy Fielding, which I did mention earlier that I probably would do another digital hangout on REST API because it's under web API, and I think it's a very useful thing to cover. But basically, the state of REST means there are certain criteria that Roy Fielding has stipulated as part of building REST API. One of the key ones is that you don't maintain any data in your request. So your request should have no data in there. So basically, if I'm making a request if you look at the example we had earlier, when we looked at the flight booking use case. On the flight booking use case, you had the same request going to multiple providers. So EasyJet, KLM, British Airways, multiple requests going there, and the same request is being understood by them. That's a RESTful. That's what we say that you are making a REST API call. The next question there says, can an API fail itself, or is it normally the source that failed? API can fail itself, but when you say API fail itself, I really don't know what that means. Are you saying that can an API request fail? Yes, if that's the question. And it can fail for many reasons. It could be that you're making a wrong request. There's always an HTTP status code for that. Or it could be that the request you have made is not understood by the end point, the end system that's providing the response to you. So there are many reasons why an API could fail. It's not always or normally the source that's failed, but the source would always give you a response back, which could be a success response or a failure response, okay? Can you explain, okay, I've already answered that. Who is responsible, another question here, who is responsible for writing API rules? Is it the BAs or the developers? Okay, now bear in mind, when it depends on where you find yourself. If you're working as a business analyst, there's nothing that states you can't write API rules. And when you say API rules, I'm assuming what that means is the specification of the API. So I would expect a business analyst to be writing the requirements in terms of what the API would do and who are the consumers of the API. So if, for example, I'm working for Stripe as a BA, I would want to understand the kind of requests that our customers or our users, meaning our web application customers, would want to make, so that I know the kind of response, or do we have, and then the next question is, what kind of response are we giving to them? Do we have the resources they're looking for, the data they're looking for, or do we have the information they're looking for? And then do we understand how they want it so that they can also consume it? So between yourself and the developer, of course, would have to build the API, develop the API, but as a BA, you would have to be the one to write the requirement, the specification of what the API should do and what the customer, of course, always from the eyes of the end user, should be doing. Okay. Yeah, thank you for all the wonderful comments. I appreciate them. How do you deal with ever-changing APIs as a tester when it comes to testing approach for data access? That's a good question. I already mentioned on the call that one of the key considerations when you're building API is versioning. I also mentioned, because it's important to be able to, so all this boils down to the maintenance of the API. So if you are very familiar with the use of APIs, you will realize, especially the ones that have good documentation for API determines whether the API would meet the needs or would serve the needs of your end users or not, because you might have all the resources. Your API might be written and everything, but if it's not well documented, your consumers would struggle to understand what exactly they need to do in order to be able to interact with your API. So if your API is always changing, what you need to think about is, how are we doing versioning? Yeah, how are we doing versioning? Because what I've always recommended, especially when it comes to API development, is to always communicate with your users. For example, if you look at the one we looked at earlier, we looked at Twitter API. Twitter API allowed you to see the operational status of the API you're trying to interact with. If it is down, it means that there might be nothing wrong with your request or with your application. It just means that their API or the server is down. So those are the things you need to bear in mind. So that's a way to keep your users aware of what is going on with your API. Another way to do it is, if you have a version, if you do correct versioning, you can communicate with your users to say, version 1 of this API that is currently live would be deprecated on the 1st of January. So if you're consuming data from us using this API, bear in mind that version 2 is now available. So we want you to start pointing your application to the version 2. Because by 1st of January, the current version you are consuming or you are using, interacting with, is going to go away. So that's how to think about it. I'll take this last question because of time, actually. Difference between services and apps, right? It means the same thing to me. So application is the software, yeah? If I can describe it that way. And I would describe an application as a software. And I would describe the services as the value that the customer gets by using the application, if that helps. So if I use the example of the weather app. So the BBC weather app is an application, yeah? But the services you get from it is weather services, to know what is the status of the weather today and tomorrow and next week, yeah? So that's the services. Those are the end value that the customer gets from using your application, whether it's a mobile app or a web application or it's a desktop application. The same thing applies to The same thing applies to APIs and services, same explanation. So an API is just a messenger. The services you're getting from it is what you're getting when you use the API. So the same, similar. Okay, thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate all the questions. There are loads and loads of questions. If I've missed your question, sorry about that. Like I mentioned earlier, the session is recorded and will be published on YouTube for you to follow and for you to ask questions on the YouTube channel as well. One thing that I must mention as well is thanks to Waymaker Learning. If you're interested, please get in touch. Or thanks to Waymaker Digital as well. If you need our services in terms of building web services or support or business analysis, remote services, agile consulting, please get in touch. Thank you so much for dialing in, and good night, everybody. I'll see you later on the next Digital Hangout. Bye.